Hello and welcome to Fireside Fairytales. My name is Rory. If you've never been here before, this is the show where we just read fairy tales by our little fireside down here. If you've never been here before either, you might not know that if you are not watching this live, down in the description there will be timestamps where you can jump ahead to stories, of which we are reading 2 stories tonight. One is called The Toller's Neighbours, which is the story of the namesake of this video, that's the story that explains where the trolls from Denmark went and why they left. It's a shorter story, so if you want to skip ahead to that one and you're not watching it live, just click on the timestamp. It'll take you right there. You can just watch what you want to watch. We're going to read a second story also today that's a little bit more nuts. It's The Boy Who Didn't Know Fear. I may have gotten that wrong, but it's something to that effect. That one's a little crazier and has... it's crazier. It didn't really fit in anywhere, and so there isn't much of a theme tonight. The first one is very sweet and pastoral and a lovely little tale. The second one is more classic, crazy... folktale stuff. And if you don't know, this is the Varietal Literature's webpage. We're a group of writers from Vancouver who just enjoy having fun with narrative. We have our own original stories on our website at varietal-literature.ca. You can also watch other videos, including the Varietal Show, where we write stuff live, which is sillier, more modern, and higher energy. On Thursdays at 6:30, there's a whole playlist of those. And you can also watch some live readings and of us reading our own works and discussing them, and if you're into any of that. But tonight we're reading stories. Holly's House says, I want to go there. I'm assuming you mean the picture in the thumbnail, which I believe is Norway. I believe it's a lake in Norway. And GS says, good evening, and good evening to you, GS. So, the one theme that I guess we could sort of scrape together tonight is... all our stories for the last couple of weeks have come from this book that I got for my birthday called Nordic Tales. And all the stories in here are in the public domain, which means that you can find them for free online. I just happen to really like the sort of arrangement and colors and pictures in this book. But if you want to find some of these stories yourself without having to pay, well, you can Google for them and so on. They're either scanned PDFs, or sometimes if you're lucky you can go to Gutenberg and even get the EPUB files. I want to show you the picture for our first story, which is Toller's Neighbor. If we can get that... Oh, come on, light. Be kind. Here, we'll do it nice and close. There's the little mountain people, which are the trolls, going to a little house. The story's from Denmark. It's called Toller's Neighbours. So, and it comes from a book called Yuletide Stories. So we won't waste any more time. We'll just get into what is a very sweet, very, very G-rated kind of story. And then we will put the mad one next. And by the way, if you want, you can always add comments in the chat. I do read the chat mostly in between stories. And it's a chance for us to discuss what we think of what we're hearing. Holly's House says, are those gnomes? I guess in the English sense, yes. See, the thing about gnomes, or like little people or the good people, is... the sizes and variations of them change a lot from place to place. So, like, you know, leprechauns are kind of gnomes in Ireland, whereas piskies are kind of, I guess, fairies / gnomes. They kind of are described in a way you could see them as a hybrid of both in Cornish traditions. But I would say that in the descriptions here of Denmark trolls, I would say they match up probably closer to what we would understand as gnomes than trolls. We think of trolls as very large things. These trolls are not very large. Or at least there's no indication that they are. And there is indication to the contrary, so no, there aren't. Okay, this story is called The Toller's Neighbours, from the Yuletide Stories, and it is a tale from Denmark. Once upon a time, a young man and a young girl were in service together at a mansion down near the Clode Mill in the district of Leesgard. They became attached to each other, and as they were honest and faithful servants, their master and mistress had a great regard for them, and gave them a wedding dinner the day they were married. The master gave them also a little cottage with a little field, and there they went to live. This cottage lay in the middle of a wild heath, and the surrounding country was in bad repute, for in the neighborhood were a number of old grave mounds, which it was said were inhabited by the Mount folk. Though Toller was the peasant, as the peasant was called, cared little for that. When one only trusts in God, thought Toller, and does what it's just and right to all men, one need not be afraid of anything. They had now taken possession of their cottage and moved in all their little property. When the man and his wife, late one evening, were sitting talking together as to how they could best manage to get on in the world, they heard a little knock at the door, and on Toller opening it, in walked a little man, and wished them good evening. He had a red cap on his head, a long beard, long hair, a large hump on his back, and a leathern apron before him, which was stuck a hammer. In which was stuck a hammer. They immediately knew him to be a troll, notwithstanding he looked... Sorry. Come on. This thing does not want to respond. Come on, wake up. This is odd. Okay, we're gonna try something. I think it just crashed. Okay, here's what we'll do. We will start that again. For whatever reason, PDF just crashed. Holly's house says in Norway gnomes are called nis. Holly's house also says there's few things I love more than gnomes. Oh, well then you'll like the story if I can ever get it to load. Who thought that it was even possible for a PDF viewer to crash? Restore, yes, absolutely. Thank you. You're gonna restore me on the page? Oh no. Okay, that's okay. We're gonna get there. This is unfortunate for the live audience, but I'm just gonna set it up for when we get back to where we need to be. Okay. We're gonna have to do this the old-fashioned way, because unfortunately this one doesn't have a clickable table of contents. So, while you guys wait for Adobe to work again, what is your favorite little character of legend? If not, I mean, Holly's house says gnomes, leprechauns, fairies. At least you have the actual book. That's true. That's true. I think that people probably would enjoy it less if it just was me reading, because I find that people have a hard time just hearing. Now, I could be wrong about that. If that's the case, I should have just been sitting in a chair reading all this time and not gone through the efforts of giving anybody a visual to look at, or the text to look at. There we are. Okay, so it is. There we are. We found it. Holly's house says this is what happens when you Try to tell stories about gnomes. Mischievous things happen. Yeah, I guess so. Okay. Now, I think we can probably... go out a bit. Still too big. Compelling. It's a good thing I'm not like a huge YouTube channel. Everyone would just be spamming me in chat right now. Oh my god, this is terrible. And we'll readjust this just a little bit. Go to 4. I think that should put us in where we need to be. There we go. Well, that's highly compelling, I know. This is what people tune in for. I'm sure we will have further little adjustments we need to make. Let me just check one thing. That's what I thought. My lord. I did not have this much trouble formatting it the first time. Let's go down to that. There we go. And there we go. Okay. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to restart. Because that is not the start we want. Okay, live folk. Pretend this is the first time. Okay. Let's hope it doesn't crash again, because it's literally never done that before. Once upon a time. There we go. Update there. Okay. This is called The Toller's Neighbours from the book Yuletide Stories. Once upon a time, there was a young man and a young girl who were in service together at a mansion down near Clode Mill in the district of Lacegard. They became attached to each other, and as they were honest and faithful servants, their master and mistress had a great regard for them and gave them a wedding dinner the day they were married. Their master gave them also a little cottage with a little field, where they went to live. Oh. The cottage lay in the middle of a wild heath, and the surrounding country was in bad repute. For in the neighborhood were a number of old grave mounds, which it was said were inhabited by the Mount folk. Though Tollers, so the peasants was called, cared little for that. When one only trusts in God, thought Toller, and does what is just and right to all men, one need not to be afraid of anything. They had now taken possession of their cottage and moved in all their little property. When the man and his wife late one evening were sitting together and talking together as to how they could best manage to get on in the world, they heard a knock at the door, and on Toller opening it, in walked a little man and wished them good evening. He had a red cap on his head, a long beard, and long hair, and a large hump on his back, and a leathern apron before him, in which was stuck a hammer. They immediately knew him to be a troll. Notwithstanding, he looked so good-natured and friendly that they were not at all afraid of him. Now, here, Taller, said the little stranger, I see well enough that you know who I am. In matters stand thus. I am a poor little hillman, to whom people have left no other habitation on earth than the graves of fallen heroes, or mounds where the rays of sun can never shine down upon us. We have heard that you are come to live here, and our king is fearful that you will do us harm, and even destroy us. He has, therefore, sent me up to you this evening, that I should beg of you, as amicably as I could, to allow us to hold our dwellings in peace. You should never be annoyed by us, and disturbed by us in your pursuits. Be quite at ease, good man, said Taller. I've never injured any god's creatures willingly, and the world is large enough for us all, I believe. And I think we can manage to agree without the one having any need to do mischief to the other. Well, thank God, exclaimed the little man, beginning in his joy to dance about the room. That is excellent, and we will in return do all the good in our power, and that you will soon discover. But now I must depart. Will you not first take a spoonful of supper with us? Asked the wife, setting a dish of porridge down on the stool near the window. For the man of the mount was so little that he could not reach up to the table. No, I thank you, said the mannikin. Our king is impatient for my return, and it would be a pity to let him wait of the good news I have to tell him. Hereupon the little man bade them farewell and went his way. From that day forwards, Taller lived in peace and concord with the little people of the mount. They could see them go in and out of their mounds in daylight, and no one ever did anything to vex them. At length they became so familiar that they went in and out of the Taller's house, just as if it had been their own. Sometimes it happened that they would borrow a pot or a copper kettle from the kitchen, but always brought it back again and set it carefully on the same spot which they had taken it. They also did all the service they could in return. When the spring came, they came out of their mounds in the night, and gathered all the stones off the arable land, and laid them in a heap among the furrows. At harvest time they would pick up all the ears of corn, that nothing might be lost to Taller. All this was observed by the farmer, who, when in bed or when he was reading his evening prayer, often thanked the Almighty for having given him the mount folk for neighbors. At Easter, Whitsuntide, which we would, well, you might not even know at all, but is when the Holy Spirit comes to the disciples, I think. We have a different name for it in the West here, which is going blank on me. Or in the Christmas holidays, he always set a dish of nice milk porridge for them, as good as it could be made, out on the mound. Once, after having given birth to a daughter, his wife was so ill that Taller thought she was near her end. He consulted all the cunning people in the district, but no one knew what to prescribe for her recovery. He sat up every night and watched over the sufferer, that he might be at hand to administer to her wants. Once he fell asleep, and on opening his eyes again towards morning, he saw the room full of the mount folk. One sat and rocked the baby, another was busy in cleaning the room, and a third stood by the pillow of the sick woman and made a drink of some herbs which he gave his wife. As soon as they observed that Taller was awake, they all ran out of the room. But from that night the poor woman began to mend, and before a fortnight was past she was able to leave her bed and go about her household work, well and cheerful as before. Another time Taller was in trouble for want of money to get his horses shod before he went to the town. He talked the matter over with his wife, and they knew not well what course to adopt. But when they were in bed, his wife said, "Art thou asleep, Taller?" "No," he answered. "What is it?" "I think," said she, "there's something the matter with the horses in the stable. They're making such a disturbance." Taller rose and lighted his lantern and went to the stable, and on the opening door found it full of the little mountain folk. They had made the horses lie down because the mannikins could not reach up to them. Some were employed in taking off the old shoes, and some were filing the heads off nails, while others were tacking on the new shoes. The next morning, when Taller took his horses to water, he found them shod so beautifully that the best of smiths could not have shod them better. In this matter, the mountain folk and the Taller rendered all the good services they could to each other, and many years passed pleasantly. Taller began to grow an old man, and his daughter was grown up, and his circumstances were better every year. Instead of the little cottage in which he began the world, he now owned a large and handsome house, and the naked wild heath was converted into fruitful, arable land. One evening, just before bedtime, someone knocked at the door, and the man of the mount walked in. Taller and his wife looked at him with surprise, for the mannikin was not in his usual dress. He wore on his head a shaggy cap and a woolen kerchief around his throat, and a great sheepskin cloak covered his body. In his hand he had a stick, and his countenance was very sorrowful. He brought a greeting to Taller from the king, who requested that he and his wife and little Inger come over to them in the mount that evening, for the king had a matter of importance about which he wanted to talk with him. Tears ran down the little man's cheek when he said this, and when Taller tried to comfort him and inquired into the source of his trouble, the man on the mount only wept more, but would not impart the cause of his grief. Taller, his wife, and his daughter then went over to the mount, and on descending into the cave they found it decorated with bunches of sweet willow, crowfoots, and other flowers that were to be found on the heath. A large table was spread from one end of the cave to the other. When the peasant and his family entered, they were placed at the head of the table by the side of the king. The little folk also took their places and began to eat, but they were far from being as cheerful as usual. They sat and sighed and hung their head down, and it was easy to see something had gone amiss with them. When the repast was finished, and the king said to Taller, "I invited you to come over to us because we all wish to thank you for having been so kind and friendly to us during the whole time we've been neighbors. But now there are so many churches built in the land, and all of them have such great bells, which ring so loud morning and evening, that we can bear it no longer. We are therefore going to leave Jutland and pass over to Norway, as the greater number of our people have done long ago. We wish now you farewell, Taller, as we must part." When the king had said this, all the mountain folk came and took Taller by the hand and bade him farewell, and the same to his wife. And when they came to Inger, they said, "To you, dear Inger, we give you a remembrance of us, that you may think of the little mount people when they are far away." And as they said this, they each took up a stone from the ground and threw it into Inger's apron. They left the mount one by one, and with the king leading the way. The Taller and his family remained standing on the mount as long as they could discern them. They saw the little trolls wandering over the heath, and each with a wallet on his back and a stick in his hand. When they'd gone a good part of the way to where the road leads down to the sea, they all turned round once more and waved their hands to say good farewell. Then they disappeared, and Taller saw them no more. Sorrowfully he returned to his home. The next morning Inger saw that all the small stones the mount folk had thrown in her apron shone and sparkled and were real precious stones. Some were blue and others brown, white and black. And it was the trolls who had imparted the color of their eyes to the stone, that Inger might remember them when they were gone. And all the precious stones which we now see shine and sparkle only because the mountain folk have given them the color of their eyes. And it was some of these beautiful precious stones which they once gave to Inger. And that is the story of Taller's Neighbours from Yuletide Stories. GS has a little crying emoji and says, "Aw." Yes, it's a sweet little tale, but ultimately a sad one. I was not expecting it when I first read it to be as sad as it ended up being. But it was a really interesting thing because, I mean, I feel like it's very obviously about people contending with, Christianity pushing out the tradition of their sort of pagan things, whatever that may be. I thought it was interesting because he opens the story by saying, like, if you're good to people, God will be good to you. But it really seems that in the end, God is not good to the little mountain folk, only to humans. And I'm not too sure what the message is there other than a sort of bereavement of a loss of traditions. That would be my guess. But I don't know exactly, right? Like, it's always a guess. Okay. GS says, what a beautiful story. Yeah, I thought so too. I mean, you can see that they definitely have some similarities, to go back to Holly's point about, they have some similarities to to gnomes. I would say they have more similarities to gnomes than most of our stories. Trolls, though, they obviously have some similarities to trolls because, while they don't explicitly outline it, they are avoiding the sun, and the tradition with trolls is when trolls are in the sun. Well, it kind of depends on where you're reading it from and what story, but for the most part, the most famous thing, which was made famous by Tolkien in The Hobbit, who was pulling it largely from, I think, Icelandic myth, Nordic anyways, but I think specifically influenced by Icelandic. They turn to stone, but others, they just get destroyed, and it's not unusual for a lot of magical creatures to get destroyed by sunlight. Actually, we're going to see a version of that in our next story as well, which is called The Boy Who Did Not Know What Fear Was. So like I said, I think I got the title wrong at the beginning, but, you know, I got the idea. This is a weirder story, but it really only gets particularly strange in the end. You'll know when we hit it, but I think it's got a strange, dark sense of humor that works really well. It is a completely different feel than the lovely story of Gnome Neighbours. And I think the title does a lot to reveal that. So I'm going to have a drink of water. I'm not going to waste too much time. We are only reading 2 stories tonight, so, you know, if there was ever a night to have tech troubles, this was it. But I still think we might finish a little early. So this is a story from Icelandic Legends by John Arneson, called The Boy Who Did Not Know What Fear Was. There was once a boy so courageous and spirited that his relations despaired of ever frightening him into obedience to their will, and took him to the parish priest to be brought up. But the priest could not subdue him in the least, though the boy never showed either obstinacy or ill temper towards him. Once in the winter, 3 dead bodies were brought to be buried, but as it was late in the afternoon, they were put into the church till the next day, when the priest would be able to bury them. In those days, it was custom to bury people without coffins and only wrapped in grave clothes. The priest ordered these 3 bodies to be laid a little distance apart across the middle of the church. After nightfall, the priest said to the boy, "Run into the church and fetch me the book which I left on the altar." With his usual willingness, he ran into the church, which was quite dark, and halfway to the altar, stumbled against something which lay on the floor, and fell down on his face. Not in the least alarmed, he got up again, and after groping about, found that he'd stumbled over one of the corpses, which he took in his arms and pushed into the side benches out of his way. He tumbled over the other 2 and disposed of them in the like manner. Then, taking a book from the altar, he left the church, shut the door behind him, and gave the volume to the priest, who asked him if he had encountered anything extraordinary in the church. "Not that I can remember," said the boy. The priest asked again, "Did you not find 3 corpses laying across your passage?" "Oh, yes," replied he, "but what about them?" "Did they not lie in your way?" "Well, yes, but they did not hinder me." The priest asked, "How did you get to the altar?" The boy replied, "I stuck the good folk into the side benches where they lie quietly enough." The priest shook his head, but said nothing more that night. The next morning he said to the boy, "You must leave me. I cannot keep near me any longer someone who is shameless enough to break the repose of the dead." The boy, nothing loth, bade farewell to the priest and his family and wandered about some little time without a home. Once he came to a cottage where he slept the night, and there the people told him that the Bishop of Skalholt was dead. So the next day he went off to Skalholt, and arriving there in the evening, begged a night's lodging. The people said to him, "You may have it, and welcome, but you must take care of yourself." "Why take care of yourself so much?" asked the lad. And there's some art that will become relevant. They told him that after the death of the bishop, no one could stay in the house after nightfall, as some ghost or goblin walked about there, and that on this account everyone had to leave the place after twilight. The boy answered, "Well and good, that will just suit me." At twilight the people all left the place, taking leave of the boy, whom they did not expect to see again alive. And when they had all gone, the boy lighted a candle and examined every room in the house, till he came to the kitchen, where he found large quantities of smoked mutton and were hung up to the rafters. So, as he had not tasted meat for some time, and had a capital appetite, he cut some of the dried mutton off with his knife, and placing a pot on the fire, which was still burning, cooked it. When he had finished cutting up the meat and had put the lid on the pot, he heard a voice from the top of the chimney, which said, "May I come down?" The lad answered, "Yes, why not?" Then there fell down to the floor half a giant, head, hands, arms, and a body as far as the waist, and it lay there motionless. After this he heard another voice from the chimney, saying, "May I come down?" "If you like," said the boy, "why not?" Accordingly, down came another part of the giant, from the waist to the thighs, and lay on the floor motionless. Then he heard a third voice from the same direction say, "May I come down?" "Of course," he replied, "you must have something to stand upon." So a huge pair of legs and feet came down and lay by the rest of the body, motionless. After a bit, the boy, finding this want of movement rather tedious, said, "Since you've contrived to get yourself all in, you better get up and go away." Upon this, the pieces crept together, and the giant rose on his feet from the floor, and without uttering a word, stalked out of the kitchen. The lad followed him till they came to a large hall in which stood a wooden chest. This chest, the goblin, now I don't understand why it just switches from giant to goblin, but they are the same, opened, and the lad saw that it was full of money. Then the goblin took the money out in handfuls and poured it like water over his head, till the floor was covered with heaps of it, and having spent half the night thus, spent the other half restoring the gold to his chest in the like manner. The boy stood by and watched him filling the chest again and gathering all the stray coins together by sweeping his great arms violently over the floor, as if he dreaded to be interrupted before he could get them all in, which the lad fancied must be because the day was approaching. When the goblin shut up the coffer, he rushed past the lad as if to get out of the hall, but the latter said to him, "Do not be in too great a hurry." "I must make haste," replied the other, "for the day is dawning." But the boy took him by the sleeve and begged him to remain a little longer for friendship's sake. At this the goblin waxed angry, and clutching hold of the youth said, "Now you shall delay me no longer." But the latter clung tight to him and slipped out of the way of every blow he dealt, and some time passed away in this kind of struggle. It happened, however, at last that the giant turned his back to the open door, and the boy, seeing his chance, tripped him up and butted him at him with his head so that the other fell heavily backwards, half and half out of the hall, and broke his spine upon the threshold. At the same moment, the first ray of dawn struck his eyes through the open house door, and he instantly sank into the ground in 2 pieces, one on each side of the door of the hall. Then the courageous boy, though half dead from fatigue, made 2 crosses of wood and drove them into the ground where the 2 parts of the goblin had disappeared. This done, he fell asleep till when the sun was well up, and when people came back to Scarlet, they were amazed and rejoiced to find him still alive, and asking him whether he'd seen anything in the night. "Nothing out of the common," he said. So he stayed there all that day, both because he was tired and because the people were loth to let him go. In the evening, when the people began as usual to leave the place, he begged them to stay, assuring them that they would be troubled by neither ghost nor goblin. But in spite of his assurances, they insisted upon going, though they left this time without any fear for his safety. When they were gone, he went to bed and slept soundly till morning. On the return of the people, he told them all about his struggle with the goblin, showed them the crosses he'd set up, and the chest full of money in the hall, and assured them that they would never again be troubled at night, so need not leave the place. They thanked him most heartily for his spirit and courage, and asked him to name any reward he would like to receive, whether money or other precious things, inviting him in addition to remain with them as long as ever he chose. He was grateful for their offers, but said, "I do not care for money, nor can I make up my mind to stay longer with you." Next day he addressed himself to his journey, and no persuasion could induce him to remain at Scarlet. For he said, I have no more business here, as you can now, without fear, live in the bishop's house." And taking leave of them all, he directed his steps northwards to the wilderness. For a long time nothing new befell him, until one day he came to a large cave, into which he entered. In a smaller cave, within the other, he found 12 beds, all in disorder and unmade. As it was yet early, he thought he could do no better than to employ himself in making them, and having made them, threw himself onto the one nearest the entrance, and covered himself up, and went to sleep. Pardon me, water break. After a little while he woke, and heard the voices of the men talking in the cave, and wondering who made the beds for them, saying that, whoever he was, they were much obliged to him for his pains. He saw, on looking out, that there were 12 armed men of noble aspect. When they had supper, they came into the inner cave, and 11 of them went to bed, but the 12th man, whose bed was next to the entrance, found the boy in it. And calling to the others, they rose and thanked the lad for having made their beds for them, and begged him to remain with them as their servant, for they said that they never found time to do any work for themselves, as they were compelled to go out every day at sunrise to fight their enemies, and never returned till night. The lad asked them why were they forced to fight day after day. They answered that they had over and over again fought and overcome their enemies, but that though they killed them overnight, they always came to life again before morning, and would come up to the cave and slay them all in their beds if they were not up and ready on the field at sunrise. In the morning the cavemen went out fully armed, leaving the lad behind to look after the household work. About noon he went in the same direction as the men had taken in order to find out where the battlefield was, and as soon as he had espied it in the distance, ran back to the cave. In the evening, the warriors returned weary and dispirited, but were glad to find that the boy had arranged everything for them, so that they had nothing more to do than to eat their supper and go to bed. When they were all asleep, the boy wondered to himself how it could possibly come to pass that their enemies rose every night from the dead. So moved with curiosity was he that as soon as he was sure that his companions were fast asleep, he took what of their weapons and armor he could find to fit him best, and stealing out of the cave, made off in the direction of the battlefield. There was nothing at first to be seen there but corpses and trunkless heads, so he waited a little time to see what would happen. About dawn he perceived a mound near him open of itself, and an old woman in a blue cloak came out with a glass phial in her hand. He noticed her go up to a dead warrior and, having picked up his head, smear his neck with some ointment out of the phial and place the head and the trunk together. Instantly, the warrior stood erect, a living man. The hag repeated this 2 or 3, until the boy, seeing now the secret of the thing, rushed up to her and stabbed her to death, as well as the men she had raised, who were still yet stupid and heavy as if after sleep. Then, taking the phial, he tried whether he could revive the corpses with the ointment, and found an experiment that he could do so successfully. So he amused himself for a while in reviving the men and killing them again, till at sunrise his companions arrived on the field. They were mightily astonished to see him there, and told him that they had missed him as well as some of their weapons and armor. But they were too rejoiced to find their enemies lying dead on the field instead of being alive, and awaiting them in battle array, and asked the lad how he had got the idea of thus going at night to the battlefield, and what he had done. He told them all that he had passed, and showed them the phial of ointment, and in order to prove its power, smeared the neck of one of the corpses, who at once rose to its feet, but was instantly killed again by the cavemen. They thanked the boy heartily for the service he had rendered them, and begged him to stay among them, offering him at the same time money for his work. He declared that he was quite willing, paid or unpaid, to stay with them as long as they liked to keep him. The cavemen were well pleased with his answer, and having embraced the lads, set to work to strip their enemies of their weapons, made a heap of them with the old woman on the top, and burned them. Then going into the mound, appropriated to themselves all the treasures they found there. After this, they proposed the game of killing each other. Did it crash again, or is... Hello? Oh, come on, we're almost done. It might have crashed again. It crashed again. Oh my lord. Okay, give me a second. We're almost done. You know what? I will read the end from the book. Let's not fuss with that again. The cavemen were well pleased with his answer, and having embraced the lads, set to work to strip their enemies of their weapons, and made a heap of them with the old woman on the top, and burned them, and then going into the mound, appropriated to themselves all the treasures they found there. After this, they proposed the game of killing each other, to try and see how it was to die, as they could restore one another to life again. So they killed each other, but by smearing themselves with the ointment, they at once returned to life. Now this was great sport for a while, but once, when they had cut off the head of the lad, they put it on, again, the wrong side before. And as the lad saw himself behind, he became as if mad with fright, and begged the men to release him by all means from such a painful sight. But when the cave folk had run to him, and cutting off his head, placed it on right again, he came back to his full senses, and he was as fearless as ever before. The boy lived with them ever afterwards, and no more stories are told about him. The game of killing each other. Yeah. Like I said, it has a bit of a weird ending, to maybe put it lightly. Since we have the book open, I'll show you the art that comes with this. It's of the great big goblin giant thing. And there's the fearless boy. Well, if you're wondering, like, why have we not had problems with this before? Why do we have problems with it today? We don't normally read our books from PDF. We normally read EPUB files. But unfortunately, these are only available as scans through a service that Google does to record and maintain books. And apparently, Adobe is having a real problem lately. I've never had this much of an issue with it. I've never actually had it crash, period. It's wild to me that it's done it twice. I was working with it today too, and it didn't crash. Anyways, that story comes from Icelandic Legends by Jón Arnason. The boy who did not know what fear was. I like that the lack of fear is like a theme to adventures, but it wasn't really the whole focus. I also like that in the end, there's this weird kind of trivialization of death that is really interesting. GS, GS says many things. GS says this story is hilarious. I love how fearless he is. Yeah, I found it really charming. It's not always the most compelling thing, but in a short story, to have a character who's just not fussed by things is almost a relief. GS says, very Count Dracula-ish. Yeah, the having to invite people in. Well, that's an interesting and exhausting reoccurrence. This boy is my new superhero. The story Taylor had a dismemberment obsession. Now, to be fair, if comes from ancient times, warfare was really marked pretty much. I mean, it still is, but in particular was really marked by dismemberment. So, like, that wouldn't be too odd. That'd be the main injury of war. The game of killing each other, I know. GS says, but what does it mean? Wow, my favorite story. Looking back caused horrible fear, a lesson learned. Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting that seeing his behind him somehow caused a terrible fright. I honestly thought that the story, even though it wouldn't really mean anything, I honestly thought that where it was going was that they would kill each other and unfortunately would run out of the potion and couldn't bring them back to life. I don't know why I thought that, but it just had such a dark tone to it in the end, a kind of darkly comic tone that seemed like a good punchline for its tone. Well, like I said, today was a shorter story, and bless it for it, because the tech problems probably would have persisted into a third story. Thank you so much for coming by and watching, though, GS and Holly at Holly's house. And thank you for anybody out there who's viewing that is not in the chat. I'm sorry for the tech problems. And if you were watching this back later, not live, I hope you use the timestamps to skip over them. Anyways, my name has been Rory. This has been Fireside Fairytales, where we read every Tuesday at 6:30. If you enjoyed it, please remember to like the video. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. Or just come back whenever you feel like it. I'll try to keep the fire warm for you. You have yourself a good sleep.